welcome to our 19th episode of the Water Talks podcast, where water treatment, practice, policy, and innovation receive the focus they deserve. I'm your host, Els Vanbeckevoort, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host, Scott. Hey, Scott, good afternoon. How's it going?
It's going very well. Els have been traveling like crazy and doing things, lots of fun things, and
Nice.
lots of miles put on in the last month. So
I
we're
feel
going to
you.
chat about that a little bit. I think today we're really excited to introduce our topic, Chemistry 101, which both of us have been working on a lot over the last month, in particularly.
Right,
And we have the opportunity to connect with standards, regulations, and regulatory bodies and industry organizations that we all work with.
right.
And it's still clear we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to kind of break just into chlorination.
Perfect. Yeah. As mentioned above, we're mostly about education in our podcast. So thank you for all of you listening. And I've been with us for a while now. I can't believe this is our 19th episode. Our purpose, obviously, is to be a resource for our listeners and help all aquatic professionals and pool guests really have a more pleasant, safe, sustainable, and healthy pool experience. That's really, the goal of everything that we're trying to do here. Scott, you were in the States recently, though. I know you just mentioned lots of travel. Perhaps, you want to share with our audience a few highlights of that speak a little bit maybe to today's topic.
Absolutely. It was great. I was down in sunny Florida. So
Lovely.
it was quite nice. I was at what's called AOAP, Association, excuse me, of Aquatic Professionals, and I go there because I belong to what's called the Council for Model Aquatic Health Code, which developed and maintains with the MAC, the Model Aquatic Health Code.
Right.
So I'm an ambassador for CMAC, and I've had the opportunity to speak for them several times. So this year I got a chance to talk about some basic ideas of water chemistry and the holistic idea, kind of what we talk about all the time. And
Right.
there's a huge, it was 1,500 people there, so it was well
Great.
attended. And the MAC group is fairly research based. So some really cool topics, some of the, what's up and coming, and that's all really why I go to keep current in
Yeah,
our
for
business.
sure.
And one of the talks was on hot tubs and a research paper that's coming out on hot tubs.
Yeah.
And while I was sitting there, Dr. Michael Beach, who we had on our
Yeah.
podcast, he was
Yeah.
a former associate director of the CDC, and the gentleman was putting up his results of his hot tub
Study.
research.
Yeah.
And Michael Beach went, "Holy hell." That's the whole story, because the results were staggering and scary all at the same
Yeah.
time.
I really believe
And
that.
he's trying to let people know some of the challenges that our industry carries. And then another young lady did a research paper. She's a PhD in public health,
Right.
and did a research paper on splash pads, and lots of good work coming out of that. So
Yes.
long ways to go, else always.
For sure, for sure. And I know that when we met with Michael, like it was obviously very clear that he's very visionary, very progressive, and would like things to move in the right direction and really fast. And we all want that, but we got to do what we can do in the short term, I guess, which is today we want to spend a little bit of time with our esteemed guests on just walking through some basic water chemistry points that are actually highly impactful, potentially, or can be highly impactful. We have a few slides that I'm going to share, Scott, and
Mhm.
then we'll just go back and forth a little bit as we go through those together. But I think in general, I want to say that if we were to just practice those things, those very basic principles correctly, life could be so much better for everybody, and that's kind of the goal, right? And what we're trying
Yeah,
to.
and that's really what we get down to. When we do things at these conferences, the post chat is sometimes the most important.
Right.
And where do we go, right? Where can we go? I was talking about, simple chemistry and some
Right.
of the things, the tools that we use to help make it better.
Yeah.
And the post chat was, how do we bring that in
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
everyone?
Yeah.
And
For
getting
sure.
understanding legislation. We just got new health regs here in sorry, not new, updated
Updated
regulations
ones.
here
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Ontario as of January 1, 2025.
Yes.
uh, for better for worse, they're in place. And I know people don't always love having a health code. If you don't have a health code, just think of
Oh
how
my gosh,
random that is. And there's still places in both Canada and the US,
that
lots
don't.
that don't
Right.
have a health code to
Yeah,
relate to.
yeah, I
So,
know. It's better to have something than nothing. That doesn't
yeah,
mean that we can't all work together to make it better, right? So,
absolutely.
on that note, let's dive in. So this is from our water health course, and we're not going to get into all of it today because we won't have time. And Scott, you and I could talk about this for a long time. So today we're going to focus just on a few basic aspects, like I mentioned, water chemistry 101, a little bit about pH and chlorine chemistry, and really the implications of that. We're going to touch on, what chlorine can and cannot do, maybe the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what we should be mindful of. So that's really the goal in what we're going to be looking at. So let's dive right in. Why do we treat water? Why do we disinfect? Well, I think it's self-evident. Scott, you talk about it always. Pools are areas of risk. Obviously, people bring in lots of microorganisms. I love swimming. Try to go when I'm not traveling twice a week. And I really appreciate, the opportunity to be able to do this. It's my workout. It's one of my bigger workouts, but I'm aware that it's an area of risk, both in terms of short-term risk and waterborne disease, but also potentially long-term health effects as well with respect to, potential toxins in the water. So I think it's important, that we look at both sides of that story, so that hopefully, we can minimize, as we look at optimal processes. Well, Scott, what do you want to say about this slide? pH
All
is
right. This
rough.
is the learning moment 101. As you know, I do a lot of CPO training, certified pool operator training, across Canada and
Right.
sometimes internationally. And this is always the piece of the puzzle that is new for people and not really realizing how they can maneuver their chemistry.
Yeah.
So I'll let you
Yeah.
dive into it. But I just love the idea of it. And it's, if there was light bulbs on people, aha moments, this
Yeah.
is it in a course.
I agree. I agree. So, saying it again for those that can't see our slides, pH is the most important water quality parameter for lots of reasons. Today, we're going to focus on just one or two. Obviously, pH gives us an indication of how acidic or basic the water is. It's a scale between 0 and 14. Obviously, for pools, we're in a more narrow scale around the neutral pH or a little above the neutral pH. In fact, Ontario regulations, stipulate a pH between 7.2 and 7.8. But that's like the size of Canada in pool chemistry for pH. That's how big that is. So we're going to talk a little bit about that because efficacy, disinfection byproducts, it's completely related to pH. So if we could really conquer this, it's like conquering Mount Everest in a swimming pool. So that's what we're going to talk about
Okay,
today.
Alice, I'm just going to stop you there because we
Yep.
have some people who are really educated in this and some who are
Hmm.
newer. Can you
Sure.
just do a real quick, what is efficacy?
Efficacy is how well something works. So effective, or how well does it work? So when we talk about chemical efficacy, we talk about, okay, your pool chemistry, your chlorine, whatever it is that's in the pool that's helping the water be safe and healthy. How well is it working? And that's really what we're talking about in terms of efficacy. There's a scientific term for this as well that's more related to, published, peer reviewed published literature, or kind of what the accepted science is. But we're talking more in practical terms. In fact, also based on, very good science as well, but in practical terms, what works the best? How can we get something work as well as possible?
Okay, sounds
Perfect.
good.
Okay, so as I mentioned, pH 7 is neutral. We're usually operating to the right of that, which is good. But like I also mentioned, there's some implications which we'll get to in a moment. Chlorine is obviously a very health saving. Michael Beach has said it. I think many of our guests have said it. It's a health saving chemical. It has really helped us to clean up our water. It's readily available. It's relatively cheap. And it has very powerful disinfectant capacity under the right conditions. And so It's being used in pools now for, I don't know, Scott, maybe you know that number, but for forever, I think, from when we first started to sanitize water. I think everybody
I
realized
think
that also.
when pools became popular in the early 19th century,
Right,
in the
right. And we have different kinds of chlorine. Most of our listeners will be most familiar with sodium hypochlorite, which is, of course, is the liquid chlorine, which typically has a concentration at the on the higher end, 12, 13%, but could be as low as 10%, something like that. That's the bleach or the liquid chlorine that you get delivered in your larger containers, or you get your large containers filled up, your tanks, and so on and so forth. Calcium hypochlorite is another type of powdered chlorine. So it's actually at a much higher concentration, usually around 75%, something like that. Very useful when you're trying to shock your pool, actually significantly quicker and easier to manage than obviously walking around from a health and safety perspective as well, compared to sodium hypochlorite, the liquid chlorine. Chlorine gas is a highly efficient way of getting the right kind of chlorine into your water, but has significant health and safety implications, though it's still widely used, and certainly in locations that are perhaps remote, or have large bodies of waters that they have to disinfect. It still can be practical and useful, but as long as the health and safety components are well looked after, uh, I guess it's still an option. The challenge, of course, with the first two chlorines that I mentioned is that when you add this chlorine, it makes your pH go up. Now, we can't get into the science of that today, but that's what happens. When you add chlorine gas, your pH goes down, which again is very interesting and useful to know beforehand, so that you can actually come up with a good water chemistry protocol, recipe, let's say. ECA, or salt electrolysis, is kind of a more advanced way from what we understand saltwater pools. So saltwater pools actually put salt in the water, and then they have an electrical generating system that actually generates also the good form of chlorine. So it's an efficient way of doing it. However, has lots of challenges with high chloride concentrations, because you're putting sodium chloride, salt, in the pool. Um, the more modern way in some of the large facilities that we visited, that this is being implemented, is where actually this process happens completely not in the pool. So you're not putting salt in the pool. You actually have a system that sets up, that actually uses salt very locally to generate chlorine, that then stores the chlorine for like on a daily basis. So then the pool gets chlorinated, but doesn't have the extra chloride in it. So that's another way in which this kind of system can potentially work, and can work well. Only those systems are high technology, very expensive, quite different from your typical saltwater pool. So those are the four types of chlorine. With ECA, or saltwater pools, also, like I mentioned, your pH has a tendency to go down. So it's important to understand, depending on the chemistry, how you need to adjust that.
right. And so for the
Yeah, go ahead.
user, else, just real quick,
Yeah,
which one is the best depends on staffing, location, availability, pH of your water. You live in Ottawa. The city of Ottawa uses gas chlorine, while the pH of
it's
water
very high because the
is
water is
right.
monochloraminated. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
for
So
sure. So it
there
really
are
depends.
other things to think
Exactly.
of as
Right,
the end user,
right.
and the other is not to be sold, right? Which people are, they get things. I like the electrolysis where it's made
It's
outside the system
Yeah.
and then injected in. That's actually old as new again, because that
It
used
is.
to be very
It
popular.
is. It is. And it's actually a very elegant solution, because the byproduct of that process also is the product that you use for adjusting your pH. So it's very interesting,
Yes.
and it helps to manage it very well. So you have little waste, but at the same time, like I say, it's high tech, it's expensive. So there are other considerations in all
Yeah.
of this. So there
Hmm.
is no one size fits all. I would say that the majority of our listeners are going to be familiar with liquid chlorine. I think that's still the most widely used. But yes, indeed, there are, like, looking at the incoming water chemistry is critically important for all kinds of reasons, but that's one of them as well, to consider, okay, what would be the best
Absolutely.
option, for sure. So then, maybe, like, very briefly, I'm sorry, we're going to have to get into the science a little bit, but without it, Water chemistry is complicated. We're trying to make it as simple as possible for everyone listening. And you're all familiar with your total chlorine. So, for pools, of course, from a regulatory perspective, you're mostly focusing on your free chlorine. Total chlorine has multiple components to it. I think most of our listeners would understand this as free available chlorine or free chlorine and combined chlorine. And then those two together make up your total chlorine. And that's okay. But the free available chlorine has two species, and that's really important to understand. So, free available chlorine, also for regulators listening. So, if any of you health inspectors or regulatory people are on this podcast, um, this is kind of an interesting conversation that we had with the ministry here in Ontario on the drinking water side, is to really always contextualize chlorine concentration of free available chlorine with pH, because without it, it's impossible to understand whether your chlorine is actually being effective, yes or no. Now, in the regulations for drinking water, there are some pH ranges that are given as well, and there's some considerations that are made for that from a disinfection perspective. But just very briefly, free available chlorine, we'll come back to that in a minute, but also your total chlorine isn't just your combined, as we understand it, to be mono, di, and trichloramines. So chlorine has the capacity, when there's organics in the water, which there is all of the time. Now, with good filtration, we hope we can remove some of this or a lot of this. But, it is, like we said earlier on, people sweat. There's always a little bit of urine being voided. There are ways in which organics come into the water, and that's very common. So the only way that chlorine can kind of degrade is by combining into other disinfection byproducts. It's the only way that it can go. There's nothing else that it can do. So combined chlorine isn't just what you can smell, your chlorine smell, but there are other disinfection byproduct possibilities as well. And so we're going to look a little bit at that a little bit later. But needless to say, your total chlorine has your free available chlorine, which has two species, and that matters. So we're going to look at why that matters in the next slide. And then it has actually different pathways, different ways in which that combined actually makes up disinfection byproducts. The most well-known ones are trichloramines, obviously.
And
Go
and
ahead,
I'm
Scott.
just gonna add a quick note there,
Yeah.
because most of our world assumes that when they smell a swimming pool, that they're smelling chlorine, and what they are actually smelling is monodiene which is another big misnomer in
Yeah.
our not only in our aquatics world amongst operators and everyone else, but the public at large
Yes.
assumes that that means the pool is clean, and
Yeah.
that's kind of
And the
opposite.
smell, and maybe just very briefly clarifying, what they can smell is not the mono and dichloramines. In fact, they are dissolved in the water. But what they are smelling is the trichloramines that are in the gas form that are actually volatile and they come out of the pool. And indeed, like you say, Scott, people think, okay, that must be good because, the pool smells chlorinated. But you should not. I think Michael Beach said, he wouldn't let his wife go swim in a pool if there was a chlorine smell, right? I think it was something like that. And I think she's a
Mhm.
scientist or something as well. I can't remember. But, it is critical to understand that, a lot of those disinfection byproducts come out as volatile organic compounds. We call them VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And some don't come out at all. But like I say, we're running ahead of ourselves a little bit here. I want to really now focus in on this free available chlorine, because Ontario regs for pools, it's between zero point 0.5 and 5 parts per million. And again, that's as wide as Canada is a country. Okay, so we talked about a wide pH range. We have a wide free chlorine range as well. Now, all respect to the regulatory bodies and the people that make these regulations. Obviously, they've made a lot of provision, a lot of room in those. But I think it's important to look a little bit in a little bit more detail how this has an impact on potentially, processes, optimal processes or suboptimal processes.
Our
So
health,
our
ultimately, our
health,
health,
ultimately,
which is
exactly,
really
Scott.
what we're looking at. Really, not when it gets down to it. When you go swimming, you want to feel good while you swim, and 2 hours later, when you get out of the pool, you should feel great. Not, oh, I feel a little off today, and I'm not sure why.
We're trying to get the city of Ottawa to, their beautiful pools, wonderful pools actually here. I was swimming in one this morning, and would love to work with those folks and have like an optimal pool. I love it, but I come out and I have like a funny feeling in my throat, and and I only swim in there. I do lengths for half an hour, so I'm not in that pool very long. So it would be great, to see more and more facilities taking this material seriously. And I think obviously there's some wonderful people in this city. So I think at some point, this might be of interest to them as well.
So,
So here we have Chlorine Chemistry 101 again. Very briefly, we talked about the two species of free chlorine. So if I go back to the previous slide, we were talking about hypochlorous acid on the one end and hypochlorite, the ion, on the other side. Now, that together makes up your free chlorine. Now, the only thing that does any real disinfection is the hypochlorous acid, the HOCl, that's chemistry. But basically, this side of the chlorine actually does a very, very quick and thorough job of disinfecting everything in its site. This side of the chlorine, the OCl minus, the hypochlorite ion, is a very weak oxidizer and doesn't do very much at all. And so it has a significant impact on how well the chlorine is working. So, for example, if you look at the scientific literature, a minimum concentration of 0.2 milligrams per liter of this hypochlorous acid, we call this free active chlorine. So the free chlorine that's actually active in doing disinfection, you only need a very small amount to actually, get your pool water, provided it's not cloudy and you have filtration and all of those other things. But there's some very important literature that shows this, and in the drinking water world, that's well understood as well, because the drinking water minimum concentration is much, much lower than in swimming pools. Now, I understand why they do that, but the challenge, of course, is that our regulations are not written to say you need to have X amount of free active chlorine. They're written, you need to have, between 0.5 and 5 ppm of free chlorine, which is all of this. So we're going to have a look at what that means in just a moment. We have some very practical examples to show our guests. But maybe, for the benefit of our listeners, there's a kind of a curve and a scale on this slide, which basically on the one side, on the lower pH, you see that the hypochlorous acid, of course, is much higher in concentration. And on the higher pH, the hypochlorite ion is in a much higher concentration. And that's why the pH is, in this situation, the most important parameter, because if you have an optimal sweet spot for the pH, you basically can have the most free active chlorine, so the most free chlorine able to actively disinfect your water. And you also can make sure that you're not generating disinfection byproducts. So there is like a sweet spot for pH. Scott, you want to share with our listeners what's the sweet spot for pH?
well, it depends on where you're looking, but I'm going to say 7.25 to 7.35, in that range. 7.3, if you can hold on to it.
Yep.
First of all, you need the technology and you need good instrumentation to do that.
Yes, sir.
The other is you have to have the knowledge, and then everybody who you work with has to buy in. And I'm just
Exactly.
going to say, Els, when you're saying free active and free available, that's for the operator. That's the DPD1 test, or their test they do every day, 2 hours or 4 hours a day. This is the test that is our baseline for all our chemical addition.
Yes. But
So
free active and free available is not the same. So maybe I should just clarify that. When you're measuring your DPD test, that's both species of free available chlorine. So that's what's available in terms of, the kind of what's not combined, if you know what I mean. Like that's kind of the free available, but it has both of those species, though both of those kinds are in your DPD test. So it doesn't differentiate, you don't know just based on, your DPD result. And we'll look at some examples in a minute, but you're right. That's exactly the test that we do every 2 hours. So that gives you the free available chlorine. The free active chlorine is taking the free available chlorine in relationship to the pH. That's what the free active is. So if you think about this, listeners, active meaning how much is actively disinfecting my water of the free available chlorine. How
I,
much
I
of
say
that?
it's simpler. I say it's the worker bees ready to go.
There you go. I like that one. The worker bees. Yes, yes, indeed. Exactly. Yeah, those are that's what we're talking about, and that's what matters greatly when you're writing regulations, when you're, looking for an optimal process, when you're looking to maximize your disinfection, minimize your disinfection byproducts. Like that's the key. And like Scott said, between 7.25 and 7.35. That's the sweet spot, because at that point you have the most available hypochlorous acid, okay, within the range of what's, within our regulatory framework between 7.2 and 7.8. But also you have the least amount of other disinfection byproducts that are being formed. Because if we go too low, of course, when we go to a pH of 7, for example, we've got lots of hypochlorous acid, lots of worker bees, but you're going to generate a lot of potential trichloramines. So there's a reason why we want to have it at that optimal spot so that we don't run into those kinds of problems as well. Here's my favorite table, and we can't really, we'll describe it briefly, but I think as we look at some examples, here's a table that was actually published many years ago by Professor Morris in the United States. And it really looks at specific concentrations of pH, or specific levels of pH rather, and specific concentrations of chlorine. And then it calculates how much of that is free active chlorine. Now, this table is something that we have actually programmed into our digital platform that our clients use, so that they actually have this at their fingertips at any given time. So they don't need to go calculating and saying, okay, where are we on the curve and what's our pH? It's something that people need to have automatic access to, so that it actually helps operators to inform their decisions on how they're managing their chlorine regimen. So as much as this is a cool slide, it's not necessarily something you want to be looking at every moment that you're hey, you can put it up, I guess you can hang it on the wall and go, where are we at?
It might breed some questions, but yeah, it's hard to decipher unless I know
Yeah,
what your favorite slide ever else. But
I know, but I've gotten over
putting
it.
it
That's
into a formula so it simplifies your
exactly. And
process.
that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to just dig
Yeah,
this in a little bit more. So here are some examples from actual clients that we work with. And this is also for our regulatory friends as well. So here, for example, we have a pool that's running 2 milligrams per liter. So 2 ppm of free chlorine, what we call free available chlorine. So your DPD test, a good DPD test, not an estimate, but a good one anyhow. And your pH would still be compliant at 7.8. But what I want to draw everybody's attention to is that at a pH of 7.8, with a chlorine concentration of 2 ppm, you have only 0.6. That's more than enough, but you have 0.6 milligrams per liter of free active chlorine. So 0.6 out of the 2 is actually doing any disinfecting in your pool. The rest of it, so the 1.4, is the weak oxidizer form of chlorine that does zip all. Okay, that doesn't do much for your pool at all. However, all 2 parts per million, as it degrades, are going to combine with organics in the pool, are going to have the potential to generate a heap of disinfection byproducts. One of my favorite words, a heap. But anyway, it's not very scientific. But you get my
it's the
drift.
point.
Yeah, it gets to the point. However, if you were to run your pool at 1 ppm, 1 milligram per liter, the interesting thing is, if you run your pH at 7.25, which is what Scott was talking about before, you actually have the same. You're at 0.586. So rounded up, you have zero point 0.6 milligrams per liter of free active chlorine at an optimal pH with only 1 part per million in your pool. So you got the same disinfecting power, but you've got half the disinfection byproducts. That's the key.
You're not creating opportunity to create more disinfectant byproducts.
Exactly, exactly. I'll give another example. Here you have, a pH of 7.7, again compliant. You have your free available chlorine at 2.5. Your free active chlorine, so our worker bees, are at 0.88 milligrams per liter. If you run a pH of 7.3, 1.5 milligrams per liter of free chlorine, free available chlorine, you have the same amount of free active chlorine as you do with 2.5. So like this is programmed into the application, very easy for operators to see how they're doing, so that you're not going to necessarily have a better outcome if you dose more chlorine. That's kind of the key message, I guess, I want to share in our conversation here today, Scott, is that more isn't necessarily better.
Right. More chlorine is, and that's kind of where our industry sits, is that more chlorine, because I call it the lowest common denominator. Let's
Right.
make it so, in case you don't know anything, we'll just, I'm a big advocate of training. I know you're a huge advocate of training as well. That's what we both do, and
Right.
try to share some of this understanding with people. And once you have, once that light bulb goes on, away you go. And then you have to just, okay, how do we get there?
Right. Right.
So,
Exactly. Exactly. And we'll talk about that in just a moment a little bit. I want to just maybe get into kind of what are the disinfection byproduct issues, or what's the problem with disinfection byproduct issues. And we've mentioned it already. Um, disinfection byproducts really are a function of the chlorine concentration, the amount of time that the chlorine is in the water. Now, in a pool, it's there a very long time. It's there all of the time, actually, and of course, the organic content in the pool, right? So it's kind of like an organic matter is always in every swimming pool. So what we see, generally speaking, in Europe, there are regulations, for example, for one of the disinfection byproducts, which I'll mention in just a moment. But what we see is that, as a rule, generally speaking, most of the facilities that we've tested, that we've also published and presented at the World Aquatic Conference a few years ago, but we have many, many more now, is that there can be moderately high, so above what would be acceptable in other jurisdictions where there are limits, or they can be very, very high. And usually it's because there is a suboptimal chemical process. So pool chemistry is not being managed the way that it could be managed. And then, high concentrations of chlorine, suboptimal, pH management, which then basically it's like a vicious circle. So if you run a very high pH, you have to add more chlorine because you're never going to get to where you need to. Problem is, if you add more chlorine, your pH is going to go up. And so you have to then start to, pour more acid into the pool potentially. Anyway, it's like a, it's a very challenging
it's a
situation.
very vicious circle, really.
It's like a vicious circle. And what we want to help our clients do, Scott, right, is to get off of that kind of crazy cycle, so that, it becomes like a really calm, well balanced chemistry that is going to give you optimal disinfection to keep people safe, because we have to, like, we can't not do that, but also to minimize those disinfection byproducts. And the challenge, of course, is that the only one that we recognize currently here in our jurisdiction, generally speaking, is trichloramines, which is the smell that you mentioned before. And so that gets a little bit more attention. The problem, of course, is that there could be other disinfection byproducts. So if you smell trichloramines, you can be almost certain that you're also going to be generating other disinfection byproducts. Now, we can't get into all of them today, but I've mentioned a few here. And trihalomethanes is one that we test for every pool that we work with. We test for trihalomethanes, because trihalomethanes are a good indicator for all kinds of other disinfection byproducts. So one of the subgroups in trihalomethanes is chloroform, which is the stuff they used to use to put you to sleep when they used to cut you many years ago. So we don't want
So
people falling.
we potentially could be breathing in chloroform at a pool, and
Oh, we see very high chloroform levels. And I tell you, if people feel a little bit sluggish afterwards, that's what it is. It's not the trichloramines. That's more kind of the irritation and the coughing of the lungs and whatever. Chloroform puts you to sleep.
wow,
So it's a sedative, right? So like it could be significantly, and again, just like trichloramines, it's a volatile organic compound, which means it comes out of the water as soon as there's any movement of the water surface. So again, when you take a deep breath, and like myself, when you go under the water and you come up for a deep breath, and like it's right there.
Right. And the
So
dirtiest air in the swimming pool is right where you
yes,
breathe,
sir.
right up to the water line.
Where I need it to be able to do
Right.
my legs. Exactly, exactly. And so we want to really, focus on this, because not only do we want to solve air quality issues with our clients, we also want to, help operators, to manage and to actually know what's going on in terms of other disinfection byproducts. We want the pool environment to be healthy. And so going back to our first, our original conversation at the beginning, we were talking about, chlorine levels and the need for chlorine, and everybody agrees, it's an incredibly helpful tool. That's the good. The bad is if we run suboptimal processes where we're not managing it, in the way that we could be managing it. The ugly is if it really kind of goes a little wild, we're generating lots of disinfection byproducts. And all of those chloroform type disinfection byproducts, you can't smell them. They don't have a smell the way that trichloramines do. So they're kind of silent, silent but deadly.
Right.
Anyway, they
There's,
potentially.
as I understand it, there's up to 100 chemicals that could potentially be on a
So
in a
far, we have discovered almost 700 disinfection byproducts for chlorine. And I've mentioned some other ones there, like haloacidic acids, chlorates, and bromates. Chlorates come from old chlorine. So, like we've talked about this, I think, in one of the previous episodes with our laboratory colleagues in Belgium, talking about, okay, make sure that you get a certificate of analysis with your chlorine so that you know that it's not old and it's not going to have chlorates, because that's the normal breakdown of your liquid chlorine. Bromates can come from incoming, incoming water potentially, but mostly really bromates can be formed also through chemicals that some people use to mask the trichloramines. But we found that it really, has a very negative effect and potentially creating some other disinfection byproducts like bromates, which are significantly more toxic. That's really my other message, I guess, in all of this is trichloramines are not fun. It smells horrible, and it's not, it's been shown to potentially make asthma worse, or it's not healthy at all. But some of these other ones from a carcinogenic and mutagenic, meaning it can change your cells. And if you look at the World Health Organization, they have some interesting studies as well. But some of those other disinfection byproducts, like we really manage that very well on the drinking water side. We ought to start managing this well on the pool side as well, because obviously people are interacting with water so much longer now than they used to. It's such an important, healthy community service, right? A swimming pool, it's important. So we don't want to stop people from using it and enjoying it. And then the staff, Scott, that have to work in it
right
all day
8 10
long.
hours a day. Right. You have young workers, typically the young worker,
Right,
18-year-old lifeguard who's got a part-time job, and
right,
they might be standing on deck up to 8 hours a day, sometimes more.
exactly, exactly.
We
And
want
so
them to be healthy for a long period of
yeah,
time, not
yeah,
just today or tomorrow, but for their lifetime. So
yeah,
yeah,
exactly,
huge
exactly.
responsibility.
Right,
Huge.
right, right. And I think, we want to keep the water safe, right? So, we want to keep it safe from waterborne pathogens in the first place. It's really important that people don't get sick, getting viruses or bacteria or even, other oocysts or other, microbiology that they shouldn't be getting from a swimming pool. But it's also important that we consider the forever chemicals, because that was the other thing I was going to say. Some of these are forever chemicals. Like it's very, very difficult to get rid of the natural environment once we generate some of these things. Like they're volatiles, they come out fine. Some of them stay in there forever. The only way we're going to get rid of them is by dilution, or by extreme oxidation processes that basically try and break some of these things down. So having good water treatment in general is absolutely critical. But then also, you mentioned it before, Scott, having the capacity for managing pool chemistry properly and correctly, using the right kinds of tools to be able to do that. And there are now some tools available that can do that, right? That makes it so much easier to to have a more tightly controlled process as well. And so if you have correct pool management, then we can actually minimize disinfection byproducts. And we see it with clients that we work with, where they would meet the strictest European regulations, which is really exciting, even in the context of suboptimal systems. Is not that they have the best of everything, but they really developed a discipline and a focus to actually say, okay, we're going to take this seriously, we're going to try and optimize this process, and we're going to take this on board and use that. And then the wonderful thing is that people save money. I mean, and we haven't really made the connection today between disinfection byproducts and money, but the way that that works, very very briefly, is that people waste a lot of water and a lot of energy and a lot of chemicals in trying to manage a suboptimal process. That's the problem, right? So when you're overdosing and you're trying to manage the chemistry, and you're trying to deal with air quality issues, and so there's a lot of extra fresh water that's being added above what the regulatory requirement is, per person per day. And so there's lots of implications there. So there's a money saving component in all of this as well, which is wonderful. So not only can you make it healthier, but you can make it cheaper to run.
Right. It's that cycle, right? And getting out of that cycle, like people get in, we talk about humans getting into cycles and they can't get out of certain things. The pool cycle is very, it's a tough one to overcome. And one is knowledge, again, tools is the other.
Right.
I had the opportunity to visit Rosewood Pool 2 weeks ago, I think now,
Right.
that I know you've done a lot of work with, and walking on deck there, and they have literally thousands of kids a week, and you walk in there, no smell. Like
Yeah.
that's the first thing you notice, and people will notice it even though they don't notice it,
Right.
right? Like you feel better. You're not
Yeah.
fighting that
Yeah. Yeah. No, it has a
you're
significant impact on
breathing.
everybody, like all stakeholders, right? So everybody benefits. And I think my message to regulators all over the world, really is, okay, start looking at these things from a systems perspective. Don't just look at the short-term risk, which, I mean, regulators do very well, I think, and we have to give them a lot of credit. But also, look at things a little bit more holistically. I think, understanding kind of pool chemistry, and kind of the relationship between free chlorine, free active chlorine, and pH, I think, is really important.
Well, and hopefully we really, what I guess what my hope is with regulation is that as we grow in knowledge, that if you bring in the tools,
Right.
technology, digital, all those kind of things, then you have a little bit more latitude,
You do.
right? And then it,
Yep.
it ends up saving you money. Like it's really where we want to go. So when you have folks who are using their cell phones rather than a rotary phone, there's a value in that, right? And
Absolutely.
we're in the digital moment, right? So let's use that technology and use the science that we have.
Yeah.
And so going back to where I came from in Florida, the discussion was, how do we bring parts of this future thinking into the model aquatic health code and make sure that people understand it. So leveling
Yeah.
either training or technology or all of it, and
Yeah.
pulling, not pushing, pulling the envelope forward.
I agree. I think having the capacity to uh, be able to track and monitor and understand
Yeah.
really what's going on in your pool a little bit better beyond the minimum requirements is always a good place to start. It's interesting. I always tell people when we do an audit together, it's like, okay, just going to warn you, it won't be pretty to start. But you're very proactive, you're very progressive, and you're doing things that many people are not yet doing. And so I always want to encourage them as well, and saying the only way is up. And it is it's like, it's extraordinary what you can achieve even with small incremental changes. And we talk about this a lot, right? We say pH, okay, like just manage that pH, start there, and see what happens. And so, don't go below 7.2. Obviously, that's why the regulator said it. It's very wise. Below 7.2, you're generating, all of your kind of your disinfection byproducts are going to go up a lot, but don't go above 7.35. Like,
Right.
I would say don't go below 7.25 and don't go below 7.35.
And
So
that's just to qualify that to folks who aren't familiar, that's normal in the European perspective.
it
So
is.
it's doable. It's not like pie in the sky.
Yep.
The instrumentation, the technology, the knowledge is there. This is just uh, touching the shores of North America, quite frankly,
Yep.
as a philosophy, and really to me, it is a philosophy that you're going to get not good, not better, but best, and getting moving beyond the regulation and going, okay, let's make our pool the best it can be, so the people who walk in the door
Yep.
feel good. We're saving money. Our operators understand what they're doing, and I'm telling you, like if you give people training and say your people are healthier, most operators have a real "this is my pool"
Oh,
philosophy, and they can see it, feel it, and touch it.
yep.
They're
Yeah.
going to be proud of the pool, and the buy-in's all there.
Oh,
So
for sure. And operators are, most of them are extremely engaged, right? They really have ownership and like you say, they take a lot of pride in what they do. So we
absolutely.
always talk about empowering people and, knowledge is power, as they say, and, a little bit of wisdom with it as well. So hopefully, little by little, we'll get there. We'll get
I
there.
think as a summary, it takes a team's approach.
Sure does.
We want to get there. We want to update and understand our water quality management, our water chemistry management,
Hmm.
bringing everybody together, including management. And my favorite CPO class is when the boss is in the room,
Right.
hearing what the operators are hearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And last week I had some lifeguards in the room as well, and I said, you play a big part in this because you deal with the people and understanding and have good understanding for them to
Yep.
to have a interaction with
For
the
sure.
people who walk in the door, because everybody has a part to play.
Yeah. No, I completely
And that's
agree.
that system approach to water quality management.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
think we're getting there, Els. Quick
We
hour.
are. We are. Like you said, Scott, we could talk about these things for a long
Yeah,
time. I think, maybe for our guests, we are very excited about what's coming next month. And maybe briefly, I'll make that bridge because, we talked a little bit about some forever chemicals today. And, some of those forever chemicals are chlorine disinfection byproducts. There are other, even more sinister forever chemicals. And there's one gentleman who I think has made a significant impact in making the world a better place. His name is Robert Bilott. We're really looking forward to hosting him next month as he's going to speak to us about his long, arduous journey in trying to also help regulators and all stakeholders, really industry alike, just to have better practices to be mindful of protecting our source water, be mindful of what we put into our natural environment. And so we're very excited for our guests who are listening. You haven't seen Dark Waters, please go and watch the movie. It's an amazing film. And Scott and I, really look forward to hosting Robert Bellotta next month.
yeah. That movie, Dark Waters. Take a moment if you haven't ever watched it. That's real, and this gentleman was the lawyer in the movie, and as a
Right.
book, and has obviously had a whole career that stemmed from that. But his interest at the beginning stemmed a whole generation of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to have people who are willing to take the long term view, right? Today in politics, everything is short term, but it makes me very excited to see that, some of us are really thinking long term. We're thinking about our kids and our grandkids and trying to be good stewards with what we've been given. So I'm very excited to listen to him. I want to thank you, Scott, for a very interesting conversation today. I hope our audience will gain something useful from it. I want to thank you, audience, as well, our listeners, for being with us again in this podcast. You can re-listen to this episode and also the others by subscribing to our YouTube channel or connecting with us on Apple Podcast and Spotify. If you have questions about this episode or any future topics that you'd like us to address, please email us at mywatertalks@sanecotech.com. From Scott and me, thank you all and have a great rest of your day.